Welcome everybody. Welcome to the 12th year of York Festival of Ideas. My name's Aftar Matharu. I am Chair of University of York Staff Race Equality Forum, and within the city I'm Chair of York Interfaith Group, and as well as that I'm also Professor of Green Chemistry. Just a few notes, first of all, technical notes to begin with. If you are watching live, you can ask questions using the Q&A button on your screen. This will be available throughout the event, so questions can be asked at any time. Should you have any technical issues, such as loss of Wi-Fi, you can always rejoin the event using the original link. Please also remember that today's event is being recorded, so you will be able to watch again. Subtitles are available in this event. To turn these on or off, use the CC Live Transcript button at the bottom of your screen. So it gives me great pleasure today to introduce Della Subin, who is a writer, critic, and independent scholar born in New York and now living in Dublin. Her essays have appeared in Harper's, the London Review of Books, New York Times, and New Yorker. Della is senior editor at Bidun. She studied the history of religion at Harvard Divinity School. And today, I'm delighted that Anna is going to talk about accidental gods on men unwittingly turned divine. And this is in response to her first book, which is also available. And we're delighted to welcome Anna today to share her fascinating exploration of man-gods across time and space. Deified politicians and imperialists, militants, mystics, and explorers. Della, welcome. The virtual platform is yours.
Thanks so much, Avtar. That was a great introduction. It's a huge pleasure to be at the York Festival of Ideas virtually. I hope everyone is doing well wherever they may be. So I'm going to be speaking today about my book, Accidental Gods, in a talk that will try to crystallize and distill some of the key ideas in the book. There'll be lots of time for questions at the end, so please don't hesitate to use the Q&A function. So, in the beginning, it was the serpent who first proposed that man might become divine. Ye shall be as gods, the creature advised, as the fruit waited. Sorrow and shame and wisdom came into the world, but whether man was any nearer to godliness, who could say? With the fall from paradise, a new trap was set for humankind. One might be shaped like a god, the same color as a god, imperious or violent like a god. One might just be in the right place at the right time. Mistakes happen. A fleet of ships appeared on the horizon, swarming the boundary between heaven and earth. When Christopher Columbus and his companions anchored off an unknown coast, crowds of curious islanders gathered on the shore. Quote, "We understood that they asked us if we had come from heaven," Columbus wrote in his diary on October 14th, 1492, although he did not know a word of their language. Yet every time he stepped off the ship's rowboat, Columbus seemed to walk on the clouds. Again and again, he reported he was hailed as a, quote, celestial being by the people he met. Conquest followed apotheosis. The altar of his divinity was the sand. Ever since the navigational accident that marked the alleged dawn of the modern age, this figure has haunted us. The man unwittingly turned divine. The sailors, missionaries, and settlers who came in the footsteps of Columbus told of Hernan Cortez, taken for the Aztec feathered serpent god Quetzalcoatl. They told of the conquistador Francisco Pizarro, mistaken by the Incas as the creator god Viracocha. They told of the Miwok people, who freely handed over their land to Sir Francis Drake, believing him to be their god, at what became Nova Albion, the first English colony in the New World. Much to Drake's Protestant horror, they lavished him with sacrificial offerings and believed that his touch could cure their wounds and injuries, as his sailors were counted, although they could not understand a word of the Miwok language. These foundational myths of the Americas seem to sanctify Europe's arrival in the New World as providential. Over the following century, nearly 60 million inhabitants of the New World would be killed, enough to cast a chill across the earth as the forest crept back over once inhabited lands, cooling the globe and blanketing Europe in snow. In 1779, Captain Cook landed on Hawaii and was reportedly hailed as the fertility god Lono. Thousands prostrated themselves before him. A priest led Cook to a thatched temple and sacrificed a pig to him, as the people sang a creation myth. After staying for a few weeks, Cook set sail again, but was forced to turn back in a storm. Landing again in the same bay, he was slain by Hawaiian warriors in an act interpreted as the ritual killing of the god. Prophecies circulated that Cook would resurrect, taking the same number of days as Christ. In the high age of empire, as Europe spanned the earth in quest of wealth, the stories pour forth of colonial officers, soldiers, and bureaucrats who, in going about their administrative tasks, were surprised to find themselves worshipped as living deities, or to see their dead colleagues appeased at tomb shrines. Perhaps most notorious was the Brigadier General John Nicholson, stationed in the Punjab in the mid-19th century, and legendary for his violent temper. It was said Nicholson was deified by a group of hundreds of devotees who called themselves the Nicholsanes and followed the wrathful god everywhere he went. European imperialists also saw deified counterparts of themselves manifest as colonial spirits in a constellation of spirit possession cults, such as the Hauka, that stretched from the Ivory Coast to the Sudan. It was uncomfortable to see your own spirit run riot in a warm body other than your own. In 1925 in Niger, when a French officer named Horace Crochitia attempted to suppress the Hauka movement, a new spirit incarnated inside the colonial prison, the deified form of Crochitia himself. The spirit led the Hauka prisoners on a jailbreak and then continued to possess people across West Africa, entering their bodies while in a trance. Spirit possession became an uncanny means of seizing the colonizer's power towards the goal of liberation. With the mid-century rise of American imperium, General Douglas MacArthur became deified in 4 entirely different countries and ways all at once, often in an appropriation of his power to try to undo the damage the American military itself had wrought. MacArthur appeared as a curing deity in Panama, a kami or divine spirit in Japan, an amphibious divinity in South Korea, and a scaly mythic prophet off the coast of New Guinea. Traditional sacred concepts were refashioned to serve new political circumstances, as MacArthur became folded into older structures of ritual and myth. Tracing the footsteps of the explorers and colonizers, along came the anthropologists, who sometimes encountered divine versions of themselves while doing fieldwork far from home. As decolonization movements got underway, Along came the politicians and activists, the presidents and prime ministers who strove for a secular authority, yet found themselves sacred instead. Among them were Nehru and Eisenhower, two heads of state, both hailed as Vishnu in the late 1950s. It happened just at the moment when, with the invention of the atomic bomb, politics itself took on the ultimate power of a god, the ability to destroy the earth in a flash. The accidental god has walked bewildered into the 21st century. From the unlikely godhood of Prince Philip on the South Pacific island of Tanna, to the economist Raj Patel, forced to dispel rumors of his divinity on his blog. Accidental gods have appeared on every continent on the map, at times of imperialist invasion, nationalist struggle, and political unrest. Often they are born in moments of loss, whether the dispossession of land, lost freedoms, or lost senses of self. They are almost always men. Of the 85 figures in my book, only 10 are women. The accidental gods rise in acts of misfired devotions, gods only briefly, unstably divine, or they mark the births of new religions. When it first happened to Haile Selassie, no one thought to inform him of his godhood or obtain his consent or even send a telegram. In 1930, Rastafari Makonnen had crowned himself emperor of Ethiopia. He invited the powers of the earth to attend his coronation in Addis Ababa, for he was deep in a struggle for succession and needed to create a veneer of legitimacy on the international stage. Reporters such as Evelyn Waugh described the scene as unrehearsed chaos, the crown stashed in a cardboard box. But the American Consul General was there covering the event for National Geographic and wrote of it in solemn biblical tones alongside sublime color photographs. In one line, he seemed to suggest that King George V's own son, the Duke of Gloucester, had paid homage to Haile Selassie on bended knee. On the other side of the earth, Jamaicans heard the news over the radio or saw the National Geographic issue, and several people had the same idea independently, that God was alive on earth right now, and he was Black. On an island still under British colonial rule, facing daily injustice and oppression, it was a deeply transformative idea. The teachings of Rastafari prophets such as Leonard Howell and Robert Hines, drawing on older currents of Ethiopianist thought, seem to subvert all existing hierarchies and point the way to an alternate future. If God resembled the faces in the crowd, everyone partook in his divinity. Quote, "You are God, and every one of you is God," Howell said, according to the notes of a British policeman. By the 1950s, an anthropologist in Kingston reported men preaching with the Bible in one hand and a weathered copy of National Geographic in the other, a magazine that at the time was notoriously racist, publishing pieces in support of eugenics and Mussolini's attack on Ethiopia. Yet as a powerful theology of Black liberation, the religion of Rastafari would transcend any paradoxes of its birth. Haile Selassie didn't consider himself Black. He identified as Semitic. The prominent activist Marcus Garvey wrote off the emperor as a Black ally in the struggle, yet found himself also swept up into Rastafari thought, becoming its reluctant John the Baptist. After his coronation, Haile Selassie was the emperor's correct name, and he would fine anybody who dared to call him Rastafari. when he eventually learned of the new religion. As a pious Orthodox Christian, the emperor was dismayed and sent apostles to Jamaica on a failed mission to convert his worshippers to his own faith. He spoke the sentence that would become the refrain of the unwitting deity, uttered by Gandhi at least 5 times, quote, "I am not God." But then again, compliance has never been an important attribute of any deity. A dictator against his own people, the worship of a distant autocrat became a profoundly emancipatory force. By the 1970s, Jamaican politicians such as Michael Manley were incorporating ideas from Rastafari theology and helping to move the newly independent island toward democratic socialism. The religion would spread as far as New Zealand, becoming a doctrine of liberation among Maori Rastas. They live in the place where it is said Haile Selassie will appear when he returns, all his angels alongside him, at the first point of the earth to see the light of each new day. If Rastafari would enter the ranks of the world religions, as they are taxonomized today, accidental gods were present at the conceptualization of these very categories themselves, especially a certain British godling who thirsted for brandy and cigars. In 1809, as the East India Company attempted to invade the kingdom of Travancore, an officer by the name of Captain Pole was fatally wounded. He was found by a Tamil group of Shanars who tried in vain to help him, then buried him in a desolate spot under a banyan tree. They searched his possessions and found brandy and cigars in his bag. 30 years later, the Anglican missionary Robert Caldwell arrived in Tinnevelly and noticed a strange phenomenon. A shrine had been constructed in worship of Pole, who had undergone some type of, quote, demonification, Caldwell reported. Quote, "An ordinary Indian demon would have preferred blood," he wrote, "but the offerings made to this English officer consisted in ardent spirits and cigars." Near the Pole altar, several obelisks were built for his spirit to rest on, for it was said the captain walked on air, never touching the ground. It was alleged that Pole was the cause of all sickness and death in the village. In the English Parliament, the story was invoked by an anti-imperialist dissenter as proof that colonialism was so inhumane, it could only be understood by the colonized as something supernatural. Captain Pole was only one of myriad British officers turned posthumously divine. From William Carden, who preferred sacrifices of hard-boiled eggs, to Captain James Stewart, whose severed head became enshrined inside a police station. He was said to notice when policemen slackened their weekly offerings to him. Though the British were captivated by their own presence in certain Indian pantheons, they were only parvenus to a long tradition of deifying those who had died in sudden or tragic ways. Killed in battle or by grisly accident, the dead embodied the violence they had seen. Deification was a way to mediate with the power of death itself, to reverse our universal defeat and turn it into a kind of salvation. With boots on the ground, advancing across the subcontinent by the hundreds of thousands, the Englishmen were only the latest to conspicuously perish. But they imposed their own meanings onto what happened next. Preserved in missionary reports, travelogues, and district gazetteers, accounts of inadvertent deification became part of the raw data that Oxford theorists in the late 19th century, such as Friedrich Max Müller, would analyze as they forged a science of religion in which Christianity alone grasped the cosmos with reason. Even Queen Victoria attended some of his lectures. She had experienced deification herself in 1883, when British papers reported a sect in Orissa that not only worshipped her as a goddess, but even extended reverence to an ornate silver dish she had presented to a regiment of troops. In his landmark studies, Primitive Culture and Anthropology, Edward Burnett Tyler told of a South Indian shrine to a British deity, quote, whose votaries, mindful of his tastes in life, were laying on his altar offerings of cheroots and brandy. The deified Englishman was grist for Tyler's theory of animism, a rudimentary stage on the spiritual evolution toward a monotheism ideally resembling Tyler's own faith. The god's unfinished brandy was a remnant, an obsolete spiritual fancy with no place in civilized religion. In his 1879 text, Modern India and the Indians, which popularized the somewhat recently invented term Hinduism in common use, the Sanskritist Monier Williams again invoked the brandy and cigars as he attempted to define Hinduism, which in his view encouraged, quote, hideous idolatry. Monier Williams strove to create the authoritative Sanskrit-English dictionary, believing it would facilitate the conversion of India to Christianity and what he called, quote, its moral conquest by Britain. So at such moments of defining religion and belief, the accidental man gods were standing by. Accounts of deification were used to paint a portrait of an irrational, fanatical East, contrasted with a rational Christian West, and marked the East as in need of further colonial rule. The righteousness of empire was legitimized through shards of proof, the detritus of worship on a tombstone. The ephemeral colonial gods were immortalized in encyclopedias. In the Scottish Orientalist Edward Balfour's Cyclopedia of India, the entry for pole, captain, appears directly above polecat, a species found in Tibet. The colonial gods also serve to exemplify a modern ideal of masculinity. In 1857, an uprising across India had shaken imperial officials to the core. A new sense of invincibility was needed to hold together an empire that ever seemed on the verge of slipping away. By the mid-19th century, earlier notions of male honor and chivalry, tied to aristocracy and noble blood, had given way to a more athletic and aggressive ideal of masculinity. It took its aesthetic from the chiseled torsos of ancient Greek boy gods such as Antinous, catapulted to Olympus long ago. Even the Holy Trinity was said to be a tumescence of the male. In 1868, the surgeon Thomas Inman noted that the male sexual organs, unlike the female, were conspicuously three. No one epitomized new ideas of manliness more than the commanding Brigadier General John Nicholson. Born into an evangelical Protestant family in Dublin, Nicholson was furious when he learned of his divinity. It was said the towering Nicholson would beat his Nicholsoni worshippers in the attempt to cease their adoration, but the more he whipped them, the greater their fervor grew. He kept a severed head on his desk, though not for literary inspiration, as he disliked writing. Instead, the general tried to ward off devotees known to slip into his field tent and prostrate themselves at his feet. 2 years after his death in the Indian Mutiny, Nicholson was canonized in Samuel Smiles's best-selling treatise, Self-Help, a foundational text of the self-help genre. For the Scottish reformer, Nicholson was the apex of masculinity, courage, and, quote, a nucleus of national character. To the question of how a person should shape himself, self-help seemed to say, act like a man who might be mistaken for a god. Nicholson's story inspired Kipling, who invoked him in the novel Kim, and other tales that painted the Orient as a kind of fantasy training ground where boys went to become real men. Kipling's fables of accidental deification, such as one called The Tomb of His Ancestors, seem to suggest that British divinity worked in everyone's favor. The wrathful man god also appeared in the first edition of the Boy Scouts Manual. Lord Baden-Powell included the script of a play in which boys could act out being Nicholson for themselves. So it was that a man mistaken for divine became a role model for generations of young schoolboys to teach them how an Englishman should act in the world. Stories of apotheosis sanctified imperialism, and they also imbued whiteness with a divinity still entrenched today. In 1519, temples were sighted drifting off the coast of Mexico. According to the Florentine Codex, a 16th century text long held to be an authoritative account of the Spanish conquest, the Emperor Moctezuma sent messengers in canoes to greet the Spanish ships, believing, quote, it was the god Quetzalcoatl who was returning. The deity, whose name means feathered serpent, was said to have created the earth in an act of discovery. Quetzalcoatl had lifted up the sky and revealed the world beneath, then sailed east on a raft of snakes, promising to return. When the emperor's emissaries climbed aboard one of the ships and saw the stout commander, Hernan Cortez, they fell to their knees and kissed the ground. They dressed the weary Quetzalcoatl in gifts they had brought, a turquoise serpent mask with a crown of parrot feathers, gold medallions and jaguar skins, a shield and scepter of precious stones, a breastplate of seashells, and obsidian sandals. They laid out 3 more outfits before him. But when they had finished, Cortez asked, "Is this all you've brought?" Within days, according to the history recounted, as always, by the aggressors, Cortez had managed to bind Moctezuma in chains. Holding the emperor prisoner in his own home, the captain consolidated his rule over the fallen kingdom. In the 16th century, just as myths of European explorers mistaken for gods were being recorded and ever retold, racial concepts of purity of blood and exclusion were imported from the Spanish Inquisition to the New World. To preserve the precarious grasp on power, the Spanish concept of limpieza de sangre shifted in meaning, from an idea of blood tainted with Saracen stain to a biological concept based on skin tone. Race, or raza, a word that had been used for animal breeds, ceased to lurk in the obscurity of what one's ancestors had believed and became visible for all who were taught to see it. Friars preached the blackness of sin and set apart the Christian sacred as pure, unsullied, and white. Forged in flesh and blood and language gone astray, it became indelible, a fiction that deified whiteness, this thing we still call race. In the fragile colonies of the New World, as indigenous and enslaved people were converted to Christ, European settlers shifted in how they self-identified from Christian to white. Stories of white gods, such as the apotheosis of Henry Hudson, allegedly deified by the Lenape as the god Manitou and what later became Manhattan, were used to reinforce territorial claims or to prove that a European power had arrived at a certain land first, for the natives had never seen men so different from themselves. Columbus was lowered from the heavens, Cortez grew scales and feathers, and Pizarro walked over the white foam of the sea. Yet peeling back the layers of these myths, they often hinged on problems of language, with indigenous words mistranslated as God in the Christian sense. The enslaved woman Malinche, whom Cortez took as his interpreter and concubine, is often said to have been the first to call the Spanish men gods. For the Aztec or Nahua people, ordinarily a person was given a name based on where he came from or what social function he fulfilled. But the strangers who washed up on the beach in 1519 had appeared out of nowhere, and their purpose was unknown. Malinche had to find a word for these inscrutable arrivals, and she used the word teotl, a term that was translated into Spanish as Dios, or gods. But in Nahuatl, the word did not originally mean anything like God in the Christian sense. It was a principle of divinity that could manifest in anything, or it could refer to anyone commanding respect, or it could be an adjective qualifying something as powerful. The Franciscan priest Motolinia, one of the first missionaries in the New World, wrote that the people referred to the Spaniards as teotl for several years, quote, until we friars gave the Indians to understand that there is only one God. Pizarro was reportedly mistaken by the Incans for Viracocha, a figure described by early Jesuit missionaries as a white bearded god who formed humanity out of clay. Yet the Quechua word itself means sea foam, a not unsuitable name for mysterious beings who arrived by sea. Originally, it had denoted a plural category of primordial ancestral beings, the founders of cities and villages across the Andes. Words such as Viracocha and Teotl became vessels for the Europeans' own monotheism, two words for God made in their own image. Captain Cook was hailed with shouts of Lono, but the same word was also used to refer to the Hawaiian king. It could mean not only a celestial being, but also a title indicating the powerful rank of a chief. Among the Taino people who first sighted Columbus, to describe a thing as, quote, from heaven or ture was merely to mark it as exotic, unusual, or valuable. For other peoples who found Europeans appearing on their shores, to say that a thing, quote, came from the sky was just a way to call it something you could neither understand nor explain. Deification can happen when a man is on his knees or flat on his face in an epiphany or prostration. But it also happens through language and history writing, through footnoting, edits, omissions, and mistranslations. What word do you translate as God, and what do you intend by it? With each retelling, from school textbooks to Civil War era pamphlets, the stories of European godhood magnified the dream of white supremacy, becoming a foundational, if overlooked, basis for the white nationalist movements that claim America for the white race alone. During the American Civil War, the influential Confederate physician Samuel Cartwright drew upon the book of Genesis to argue that only the white race was made in God's image. For Cartwright, centuries of racial mixing had polluted the very concept of man itself. To remedy this, he suggested that, to refer to what he called, quote, pure-blooded white men, we should use the term gods instead. Quote, there is coming a day when your race puts back on immortality. Wesley Swift, a former Ku Klux Klan organizer and founder of the Church of Jesus Christ Christian, announced in a radio sermon in 1963. As a swelling tide of hundreds of thousands, led by Martin Luther King Jr., marched on Washington that same year, Swift told of Quetzalcoatl and Viracocha, and of a future in which the white race would be bathed again in light. He drew upon a spate of recently published histories with titles like In Quest of the White God, or Fair Gods and Stone Faces, a genre that had a revival again in the 90s. On the White Nationalist Forum Stormfront, among the earliest on the internet, threads evoke the pantheon of white men mistaken for gods as proof of the intrinsic divinity of the white race. Quote, God is in our Aryan DNA, so we must do everything to be eternal. A user called Aryan7314 Godsplains. Users debate and condemn the Black godhood of Haile Selassie, pointing out that even he refuted it. It all seethes and foments, becoming scriptural material for the religion of whiteness. So I leave off with the question, how do we undeify what has been made divine? How do we kill the doctrine that has made gods out of white men? Quote, the myth dream of absolute white supremacy brooks no opposition, the poet monk Thomas Merton wrote, not long before his sudden death in 1968. Quote, it is our collective daydream, made up of all kinds of common symbols and beliefs with which we are collectively at ease. Even when we think we are being nice and fair and just, we are living and acting out a dream that makes fairness and justice impossible, the monk wrote. It may be that the only way to fight old myths is with new ones, to wrest back the territory of the sacred, or what I call the space of mythopolitics. Wrote the poet Fernando Pessoa in 1913 on the eve of war. We must lull hatred to sleep like a captive snake. So that's the end. Thank you. So now I think we could take some questions.
Della, thank you very much. Fascinating journey from Haile Selassie all the way through to modern day white supremacy, hearing about brandies and cigars, sickness and death, imperialism versus empire, colonialism, masculinity. You've taken us through a fascinating journey, and the questions are building up in Q&A. If I can just start with the first one, and I'll just show the book again for those who can see that this is your first book. It's very masculine and very male gender. Why aren't there more women that have been turned into accidental gods? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, I didn't set out to write a book entirely about men. One of my favorite novels is E.M. Forster's A Passage to India. And I genuinely thought I'd find more characters like Mrs. Moore, who's this kind of wizened older mother who becomes worshipped because she properly realizes the injustice when a man is wrongly accused of a crime. So I thought I'd find more real life Mrs. Moore characters. But I really couldn't find many female figures at all. There were a number of colonial wives, or the wife of Haile Selassie, Empress Menen, is worshipped in the Rastafari tradition. Or there was the group around Queen Victoria that I mentioned. But I think the reasons for this, you have to look at who's writing down the stories. So in my book, most of the stories are written in context of colonialism. They're written by largely male, white Christian chroniclers of empire. And to ask who gets mistaken for a god, well, what does God look like? And in these traditions that are writing down the stories, God is male. He's the Christian God, the Father. And so I think, a lot of it has to do with who the storytellers are. If I had just focused the book on India, for instance, which has these kind of different rich traditions of deifying people who've died in accidental ways, then I think I would have achieved much more of a parity in the figures. But
Della, thank you. We've got a host of questions in Q&A. Some of the audience members have asked a couple of questions, and I hope they don't mind that if I select one where people have asked more than one question, or where the same person has asked more than one question. Just as a follow-up question, then we'll just start off with a question from the audience that says, where did your research for your book, Accidental Gods, start? I know you started with Haile Selassie. I assume it's a bit more about your backstory. Why research this topic?
Oh, sure. Yes. So I had just graduated from Harvard Divinity School. And then I took a job at Badoon magazine, where I'm an editor, and that's a magazine of Middle Eastern culture. And the revolution in Egypt began in 2011, and we moved to Egypt to write about what was happening in the revolutions. And so I kind of went from studying pretty much ancient religion at Harvard Divinity School. I worked a lot on kind of early Christian traditions of deification, and also Indian philosophy. And so I was thinking a lot about deification before, and then I sort of found myself in the middle of this kind of revolutionary moment and this kind of political ecstasy just after the fall of Mubarak. And so I started thinking a lot about charismatic autocrats. And I became obsessed with the story of Haile Selassie. And I actually traveled from Cairo to Addis Ababa, thinking that the flight would be short, which it wasn't at all. And so I just was obsessed with this idea that a man on one side of the earth could become a god on the other side without ever agreeing to it or consenting or even knowing about it. And I started searching for more examples of this in history. And the more I looked, the more I realized that these stories were so bound up in histories of colonialism and race. And that they really worked in two ways. Acts of apotheosis were used both as a kind of powerful way to build solidarity and emancipation movements, but they were also used to deeply oppress and sanctify imperialism. So I realized I was wading into something that was very kind of complex and paradoxical, and that sustained me for the 10 years that it took me to write the book.
Della, thank you. And hopefully the question that was asked, I've sort of phrased it appropriately. If I haven't, if the questioner can re-ask the question, I'm happy to take it further. We have another question. It says, you mentioned Queen Victoria and Prince Philip being worshipped. Is it just because of their royal status or other factors? And have other royals been made accidental gods?
That's a great question. So in the case of Victoria, her face was appearing on the coin that was circulating everywhere in India. And that in particular was the detail in that story that led to her deification, because her face was kind of everywhere. And gods historically, they're the ones who appear on coins. Even our word money itself comes from an epithet for the goddess Juno, moneta. Gods watch over the value of currency. And so having your face appear on a coin or currency is kind of a deeply divine place to be in. But in the case of Prince Philip is really interesting. I think, the story is probably familiar to a lot of people because it's become a kind of set piece in his official biography, that he's worshipped as a god on the South Pacific island. But people haven't really taken the time to really understand what the Philippist theology is about. It's not so much based around his royalty as that he was recognized first in the 1950s and 60s as having a kind of shared spirit with people on Tanna. So they were interested in him. But then in the early 1970s, he was vacationing on the royal yacht Britannia with the Queen when some chiefs caught sight of him standing on the deck. And they knew that he was actually the son of their local volcano god, Calbobbin, who had gone out into the world to work for the benefit of Tanna, but would return someday. And so this idea persisted and grew into a movement that, actually struck up a relationship with Philip and the palace. And some of his worshippers actually ended up going to meet Philip at one point. But they have this really interesting set of ideas that Britain and Tanna were once connected islands. They were created by the same volcanic explosion, but continental drift just pushed the islands away over time. But it explains why Vanuatu used to be called the New Hebrides. And they have this idea, that if you're a Black person, you have a white counterpart or doppelganger living on the other side of the earth, and vice versa. These kind of like divine counterparts or twins you might encounter. But it's this deep theology of connection on an island, which gets written off as being somehow marginal to the world. It's a really interesting way of kind of participating in a larger global order and insisting on racial equality.
Thank you. So I've got a choice of two questions here from the same person, and I hope the person doesn't mind. I'm going to pick what I think is the stronger of the two questions. And what do you think deification can tell us about colonialism?
Yeah, so, divinity is all about power. It's a kind of staking of power. And so to me, politics is kind of always about creating gods or making claims about who is more and who is less than human. And I think race also is deeply a set of claims of who is more than human, who is less than human. And I think looking at these stories of deification, they may seem like sort of wacky or marginal, but they really let us get at, the often like deeply dark and sinister like workings of power and racializing thought that have been at play in histories of colonialism and right up to the present. And also at the same time, as I went through a little bit in the middle of my talk, these stories of deification, particularly the kind of archetypal British godling who is worshipped at tomb shrines with brandy and cigars, this figure keeps reappearing in the authoritative scientific texts of the invention of comparative religion as an academic discipline. So in the work of Max Mueller and Tyler and other figures I mentioned. And so they're actually being like studied by the theorists who really framed our modern understanding of religion itself. And so it's also really an interesting way to get at, okay, what do we actually mean when we talk about religion today? Where do those concepts actually come from?
Thank you. And then just to push this a bit further, it's a great question. How do we deify what has been made divine?
How do we how do we undeify, or how do we?
The question is how do we deify what has been made divine? So we might get some clarity. So the person who asked the question, is it how do we deify or how do we undeify? And I know, Anna Dubin, you mentioned at the end, how can we change things?
Yeah, exactly. So, at the end, I'm suggesting that myths are really powerful. In the case of Haile Selassie, or other figures in my book, even the Prince Philip movement, which arose just at the moment when Vanuatu was decolonizing from the British and the French. Deification has been a kind of powerful form of imagining new futures, new ways to live. And I think, one way to kind of undeify the gods of oppression is to write your own myths or create your own gods, or to kind of seize back this space of the sacred. In my book, I use this word mythopolitics, which I think it's not a word that's in any dictionary, but I think it's a good one because it kind of captures how politics is so often driven by deeply mythological thinking. And by myths, I mean stories that are also theories that tell us how things came to be the way they are, where we're going. They're not necessarily true or untrue, but they're powerful calls to action. And I think sometimes, in an American context where I'm from, the American right wing has a much greater grasp of the mythopolitical than the left wing. You see Trump and the deification of Trump and QAnon, and there are all these powerful myths that are really galvanizing. And so I'm just kind of suggesting, why don't we create our own new stories and deities to try to move towards the future we want to live in?
Thank you. And we'll take one final question. What are the advantages to being revered as a god?
Advantages, yes. I'm in my book.
Disadvantages.
Disadvantages.
What are the disadvantages to being revered as a god?
Yes. So one funny example of this is the economist Raj Patel, who many of you might have heard of. And he's an author, an economist, and he had appeared on an American TV show, The Colbert Report. And then suddenly all these messages started flooding into his phone saying, "Are you the one?" And he was like, "What's going on?" And it turned out there was this British sect called Share International, where this occult guru, Benjamin Creme, had made the declaration that there was a figure who just appeared on an American TV show who fit all this prophetic criteria to be the Messiah. And so suddenly Raj Patel was on a book tour, and suddenly all these people started showing up at his book events, and he was like, oh, why am I getting so much attention? And he had just had a baby, and his godhood, it just became like exhausting and an invasion of privacy. And he agreed to meet Benjamin Creme for a face-to-face encounter where it was realized that his godhood was all a mistake. But for Patel, it was most disturbing because it completely went against his own message. In his work on food, global food equality and ending hunger, he's saying, don't wait for a Messiah. We have to take collective action. And then suddenly he was, pinned down as a Messiah in this mystical way. So he's a kind of more comic example of the disadvantages, but it's also, there's a real danger that as a god, your message might become something completely other than what your humanly mortal message is. This was also true in the case of Gandhi, who appears in my book, who was hailed as an avatar of Vishnu on an early speaking tour in Uttar Pradesh in the early 1920s. And the worship of Gandhi actually led to these terrible acts of violence as he was trying to spread his message of nonviolence. So there's this danger that you become a sort of dark double of yourself when you become a god.
And Della, thank you for a fantastic talk. Brilliant answers, well measured, and in a way, you are the one today. I'll certainly say that. Your first book is amazing, and I'm sure it's the first of many. May I just add some suggestions? Accidental gurus.
Yeah, absolutely.
Doctors and accidental gods. Social media and accidental gods. Martyrdom versus accidental gods. And I look forward to watching Angry Birds again. Accidental gods in that film. And it's been a brilliant hour. Thank you so much. Just to remind the audience, thank you for your questions. I think your questions have been fabulous. The recording of this event will be available on the festival YouTube channel, which can be accessed from the Watch Again section of the festival website after the 24th of June. And you'll be contacted by email when the video is available to view. So do look out for that. And if you'd like a copy of this fantastic book, Anna's first book, Accidental Gods, on men unwittingly turned divine. The book's available from our partner bookseller, that's Fox Lane Books, but also you can head off to our website and find details of that book. We very much hope that you will continue to be engaged with the York Festival of Ideas. Remember, this is our 12th year. Please click onto the website, and thank you for your kind attention, and goodbye. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks so much, Avtar, and thank you, everyone.